from having a stable home to having nothing was really traumatic, because I didn't know where to go or didn't have any safety nets anymore. Having to sell myself as a means to survive was a way to adapt to my situation.
Are they being human trafficked versus are they being sexually assaulted? You know, that's where we have to dig into that investigation.
But you never hear of that. You never hear of anybody being held accountable.
There are actually quite a bit of people in this town who want to be able to make that phone call and meet up down the road or pick them up here and there and everywhere.
In the city of Kenora, Ontario, the sex trade is played out in the streets.
We know that there's people in this community who think that it's survival sex, or, you know, some people who think that these older white men they care about them, you know, they want to try to help them, so they let them go and stay there, but it's always at a price, right?
Sexual exploitation, sex trafficking. Anyone can be a victim, but marginalized people are especially at risk.
Our human trafficking numbers, per se, by calls for service that we get, you know, they're not that high. But we know that that's not an accurate number as to what's really happening in the city of Kenora.
Sex trafficking has been called modern-day slavery, a hidden epidemic, but one that also operates in plain sight.
Just like any other business, goods and services, production, distribution, it's pretty much all the same thing. It's just that you got to be a little more discreet.
Kenora, Ontario, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe and Métis of Treaty 3, a scenic city resting along the Lake of the Woods, 2 hours east of Winnipeg. But when the sun goes down, the streets tell a different story.
You don't necessarily have to be 18 to have an addiction and to want to feed that. And if they can figure out at a young age that they can use their bodies to do it, they'll do it.
Ruth Mashimate spent over 5 years on the streets of Kenora. She worked in the sex trade, all to feed a $200 a day drug addiction.
From there, I did meet a lot of individuals who were willing to give me the money I need for the acts they wanted. And just throughout the years, meeting different people and just having that disgusting, dirty feeling of having to perform sexual acts with people for money.
And that's part of what separates the sex trade in Kenora from larger cities. There are no escorts, no back pages, no websites. Often it's as simple as word of mouth and who you know.
A few of the girls would come and say, well, how do you do that? I said, well, I'll introduce you to somebody. So I did that a few times, but then I realized, you know what, this is basically cutting into my profit, because if I'm handing out my sugar daddies to somebody else, they're making the money off. I'm not getting anything. So I started to say, you know what, if I'm going to hook you up with somebody, I need something. That's kind of where that started.
She says most of the clients were older white men, and the sex workers were all indigenous, each battling addiction cloaked in the trappings of trauma.
I had a hand in hooking up other girls, connecting them with other people where I didn't have to do it. Then slowly it just kind of evolves into more people wanting the same thing, and just like any other business, goods and services, production, distribution, it's pretty much all the same thing. It's just that you got to be a little more discreet. And
Indigenous women and girls are especially vulnerable to being targeted, and it's often done by people you'd least expect: family members, spouses, other women.
You know, we have to keep in mind that the community needs to be safe for the people that we serve to, and efforts need to be made to ensure that they are safe, you know, from exploitation, violence, racism and discrimination, right? That those are heavy issues that continue to be in this community.
Yvonne Bearbol is the executive director of the Kenora Fellowship Center. The center has been a staple in the community since the 1960s, a safe haven for Kenora's vulnerable population.
Hey Tyler, how's it going? You having fun on chat? We have people who've come through the day school, 60 scoop, you know, the whole range of traumas that our people have faced. And a lot of people who are young people dealing with aging out of the child welfare system. And, you know, we see the intergenerational trauma. We see the family, children and care starting to come here now, right? They're coming here where their parents were and their grandparents were, so we see that cycle continuing.
Residential schools, Indian day schools, the 60 scoop. Intergenerational trauma that continues to play out on the streets of Kenora and across the country.
And that's something that we've tried to raise awareness about, you know, the community healing that needs to happen, and everybody blaming our young women, our women for participating in that, but it takes two to make this happen. So, you know, that awareness needs to be on them too, but you never hear of that. You never hear of anybody being held accountable.
But it's not just Kenora. Ontario has one of the highest rates of sex trafficking cases in the country. The province recently invested more than $300 million on a new strategy to reverse the trend.
Is it a case of, are they being human trafficked versus are they being sexually assaulted? Are they being assaulted? You know, that's where we have to dig into that investigation and find out exactly what's happening there. Yeah. You know, our human trafficking numbers per se by calls for service that we get, you know, they're not that high. But we know that that's not an accurate number as to what's really happening in the city of Kenora.
Jeff Duggan is a 20-year veteran with the OPP. Born and raised in Kenora, he's been the city's detachment commander for the last 3 years.
Well, it's really hard to look at somebody and say they're a victim of human trafficking. I mean, it's so hard to recognize per se. But as you get to know people, and you know, that's one of the things we encourage our officers to do, and I certainly do it as well, is when you're out talking to people and you kind of get their baseline, and if they're outside of that baseline, or if they're outside of that normal, I would say, you know, what is really going on in their life. And for us, with the addictions and the homeless or vulnerable population, you really have to dig down deep into what that baseline really is.
And while it's a blurred line between sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, Duggan says there's another type of abuse on the streets.
Are you seeing the sex abuse reports among the vulnerable population more than others, or is it among that, or is it more spread out?
We definitely see an increase in those numbers with the vulnerable population. With the vulnerable population comes the addictions, the homelessness, and that sort of systemic problem, I would say. So yeah, I mean, the numbers are definitely higher in that population for sure.
A cycle of trauma and abuse that Ruth Mishimite still carries the scars from. She grew up in a small reserve and was first sexually assaulted at the age of 12.
The abuse around the sexual part of it started at a young age, where I didn't know it was any different than something, because I've had experiences where someone had come in and seen it happening and basically just turned a blind eye and said that's basically normal. And going from having a stable home to having nothing was really traumatic, because I didn't know where to go or didn't have any safety nets anymore.
Ruth spent the next few years being shuffled between foster homes, detention facilities, and treatment centers. She ran away for the last time when she was 16 years old, ending up on the streets of Winnipeg, where she was first introduced to the sex trade.
When I was 16, I started to interact with the gangs in Winnipeg, and my drug addiction got to the point where I was IV using cocaine. And in order to kind of support that habit, like I was 16 in this city with no income, the people I associated with said, well, here, you sit here, you do this, we'll give you what you need as long as you just sit here and watch. And what I had to do was keep an eyes on girls that were selling themselves, where I'd take license plate numbers, take how long they'd be gone, and collect money, whereas at the end of the day, the people who I was sitting there for would collect and give me what I needed for my addiction.
There are common practices in the sex trade: manipulation, exploiting trauma, trading favors to feed an addiction. When Ruth moved to Kenora in 2014, she was addicted to meth, cocaine, and pills. A lifetime of trauma, and it took her to the brink. But it also introduced her to some of the most powerful people in Kenora, looking to gratify themselves, whether they knew it or not, with the trauma of Indigenous women and girls.
Just like basically any other business, it kind of evolved into meeting more people, hooking up more girls. And when I think about some of the individuals who I guess required services, were people you, I guess, hold in high regard in society. I don't know how else to put that. So much has changed in the last year. I know my personality's changed. I know my demeanor has changed. And incorporating my culture into my recovery is really key.
For the last 5 months now, Ruth Mishimite has been living in a recovery home on the outskirts of Kenora. She's been clean and sober for the last 16 months, the longest she's gone without drugs or alcohol since she was 12 years old.
Realizing that I was slowly killing myself and the amount of people that I've lost, and having certain people always say, you know what, Ruth, you're stronger than this, you can do better than this. Just having those people believe in me that I can do what I'm doing and to be successful at it.
It's a drastic change to the life she was living less than 2 years ago. a life in the sex trade, one fueled by addiction, a life that put her in contact with all types of clients, some of who, she claims, were police officers.
I've probably encountered a handful of cops that were willing to pay for services. It's sad to know that these individuals will prey on somebody like that. I don't know how else to put that.
Ruth claims that one officer is an active member of the Ontario Provincial Police, who is still in contact with her to this day, trying to pull her back into the life she has fought hard to escape.
What would he say to you when he reached out to you? Do you remember? How does he do that?
First it was your small talk, like how are you doing? Are you doing okay? Are you still straight and sober? Are you still up to old habits? And as soon as he said old habits, I kind of got a sense of what he was talking about.
And given the seriousness of the allegations and the people involved, it's easy to see why victims of sexual exploitation don't typically come forward.
We've heard stories of officers actually taking advantage of women who are, on the street. We've heard. Have you encountered that at all? Are you able to talk about that?
I've heard stories too, right? And sometimes I've sat and listened and really couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's not my place to say whether they were right or wrong, but I've heard them, and I did my best to let them know that I believed them. And it was always their choice if they ever wanted to do anything about it, right?
The Kenora Fellowship Center is located in the heart of the city, a safe zone for the community's most vulnerable population. But according to Devon Bearbowl, it's also become a target.
We try our best to monitor everything that goes on here. Sometimes there's lots of different things that are going on, so we can't see everything. We know that there's people in this community who think that it's survival sex, or some people who think that these older white men they care about them, they want to try to help them, so they let them go and stay there, but it's always at a price, right?
Survival sex. It's a term for sex work that preys on victims out of their extreme need, trading sex for food, a place to sleep, or more commonly, to feed an addiction.
We've taken pictures, and we've shared information with the OPP, and but again, it's that willingness for them to say what's been going on, what's happening.
Yeah, I guess ultimately there's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah.
I guess it is a choice, but when it's to feed an addiction that's based on trauma, it's not really a choice, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Kenora's a small town, and we're not Sudbury, we're not Sault Ste. Marie, we're not Thunder Bay, we're not Winnipeg. If somebody's here and they shouldn't be here, if somebody's here and they're with somebody that we know and we don't know who that person's with, we're gonna stop them, we're gonna question them.
Kenora may be considered a small town, but it's also a major center in northwestern Ontario, surrounded by First Nations communities. And some consider Kenora a main hub for sexual exploitation.
We were here yesterday, we interviewed Yvonne, and she described it as that their fellowship grounds is a safe zone, but there are certain men, so this is where we're going to get into maybe a bit different of the trafficking sort of thing. There's certain older group of men, white men they said, who come here and they'll sit in a vehicle, and the women will know to go to them. And those women will disappear for a couple of days with the men with their pension checks or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they said that they've taken pictures and they've complained to police about this. I get that it's a choice. The women are choosing, I guess, if you want to say that. It's obviously they're addicted and that's rooted in trauma. What do you think of that when like there's guys here that know that they can prey upon that trauma like that.
Yeah, and we certainly do know there are men that do that, and we know who they are. And really, Kenora's not a big enough city to not know who they are, right? We're not Toronto, we're not Winnipeg, we're not, they can't disappear to a different section of town and we never see them. So we do know who they are, and we know who the women are, and then that's where the engagement part comes in with the girls that are being, taken by those men. But it really is dependent on those people coming forward to say, this is what's happening to me. And when that happens, and when we do get those occasions when that happens, that's when the wraparound services come in.
When I get up in the morning, I've started to practice changing my thought patterns. Because whereas in the morning, with being an addict, I would have had to wake up saying, where's my next fix? I don't like being sick. So every morning when I wake up, I say to myself, I'm beautiful, I'm worthy, I'm intelligent, and I'm capable. And with all that, I'm starting to believe it.
It's become something of a daily ritual for Ruth, learning to believe in herself. It's also about forgiveness.
With being on the street and having to do the things I did to make money for my addiction, I always felt a deep heaviness about that, because I knew what I was doing wasn't necessarily morally right for anybody, the people I introduced it to, or the people I did it to, or even who I did it with.
Acceptance, letting go of the past. It's all part of Ruth's healing journey.
Because living the addict life and having to sell myself as a means to survive is a way to adapt to my situation. And with adapting to my situation is where a lot of that guilt came in, because, as I said, I knew morally it was wrong from what I was brought up to believe.
It's kind of about forgiving yourself as well, right?
And that's the biggest thing that I've come to learn or accept is just like loving yourself, loving anybody else. You have to learn how to forgive yourself first before you can forgive anybody else. And whereas I didn't feel like I had remorse or guilt or shame for anything I did, that was just part of learning how to forgive myself.
Next week on APTN Investigates.
This woman is on record saying, naming the officer and saying, this is what I did with him while he was an officer. He still is. And how do you get around that when there's stories of your own officer partaking in that life?